This is Soch 4420, week 14. Our topic for today is yes, juvenile life sentences without parole are cruel and unusual punishment. Our group members are Chris Jackson, Victoria Anderson, Reagan Bell, Lillian Hall, and Rachel Ball. We're going to start today with the history of the JLWOP, also known as juvenile sentenced to life without parole. So here's some quick facts about what the JLWOP is. The JLWOP is a sentencing of life in prison without the possibility of parole for a defendant younger than 18 years of age. This extreme sentencing began during the tough on crime years in the 1970s and 1990s. There was shown to be an increase of 208% between 1990 and 2004 of the number of children sentenced and sent to serve time in adult jails. Just want to stop there for a second and emphasize that that is children being with adults. Later we're going to talk about some other things that are illegal with regards to children being exposed to certain types of environments, and remember that this is an important factor to take into account. So the third section is very few countries have historically used life sentences for juvenile offenders. Indeed, a single country is now responsible for 100% of all child offenders serving this sentence, the United States. 10 other countries have laws that could permit the sentencing, but there is no documented cases that it has occurred. Here are the 10 countries: Antigua, Bermuda, Argentina, Australia, Belize, Brunei, Cuba, Dominica, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines, and the Solomon Islands and Sri Lanka. 44 out of 50 states in the U.S. allow JLWOP to be imposed. That's a significant number of states that allow for juveniles to essentially go into prison with adults as children for the rest of their lives. And for those that know, obviously prison systems are not a safe environment for children, and it could cause a lot of other crimes to actually take place. The United States has at least 2,484 children convicted of crimes committed before the age of 18 who are now serving in JLWOP sentencing in the United States prisons. That's an astounding number of children that are in the criminal justice system being tried in the same environment that adults who may be much older, that are much older than them, are, and they are exposed to those environments. The United States is the only country in the world that permits youth to be sentenced to life without parole. I think that's an interesting fact. I mean, think about it. There's over 100 countries in the world, and we're the only one that's doing it. In my opinion, I don't think we are somehow superior in our way of serving justice, and so I think that there may be something there to consider. Sentencing children to die in prison is condemned by international law. So for children and adults, the life sentence without parole is cruel, inhumane, and denies the individual humanity, because essentially they're basically told, okay, the rest of your life you're going to be in prison. And if they're 15-year-old and they're going to live to be 100, just medical advances, obviously prison probably lowers that life expectancy. But let's just say they live to be 100. That is essentially 85 years in prison. That's more than any adult that's done any type of crime, that's gotten away with crimes many, many times, and maybe just got caught on the wrong day, versus a kid who probably didn't know how to hide from the law anyways and messed up. And we'll talk about some things from the mental standpoint of children and how that is a factor to consider as well. So internationally, this is not popular. We just talked about that. I don't want to go too much in the weeds on this, but just these are some articles specifically to consider that the United States essentially does allow. So states parties recognize that every child has an inherent right to life. State parties shall ensure the maximum extent possible the survival and development of a child. Article 27, state parties recognize the right of every child a standard of living adequate to the child's physical, mental, spiritual, moral, and social development. Article 34, state parties undertake and protect the child from all forms of sexual exploitation and abuse. For these purposes, state parties shall in particular take all appropriate national, bilateral, and multilateral measures to prevent, the inducement or coercion of child to engage in any unlawful sexual activity, the exploitative use of child in prostitution or other unlawful sexual practices, and the exploitative use of a child in pornographic performance and materials. So just to kind of recapitulate all this, essentially these are things that by allowing a child to go to prison for life in the adult criminal justice system, they're being exposed to all these things. So the United States is not abiding by the Convention of Rights of the Child that the United Nations adopted in 1989. So that's something very clear to emphasize. These are things that you would think every country, including the United States, just abides by, but inherently just by having the child exposed to adults, there's obviously the risk of things happening in prison, and they inevitably will happen. So these things that are being described are taking place right now by over 2,400 children. So just let that sink into your minds when you're deciding on whether this is a good idea or not. Here's some of the other articles. I'm not going to go into a huge detail on these, but keep in mind these are other articles go into more depth into what we just described. Here's some other statistics with regards to specific states and ramifications of laws with respect to children and their protection. So there are many things that have been adjusted and changed over time. At the end of the day, though, there's still 44 states that are allowing children to be exposed to certain things, which you could say are contradictions in and of itself, just because of the ability for them to go to prison without parole for life. So that's something to consider, even with ramifications and things that are being done by the majority of states that may be positive. We know from history as well that child labor laws didn't even come into effect until later in time as well, and so it's hard to imagine that we are where we should be from just a law standpoint, because I think there's a lot of things that we've seen over the last few years that maybe in the past we thought they weren't inhumane, but now they are. For example, even things like whipping a child and doing different things with children are not seen as favorably now. It's only safe to say that a lot of things have changed in the criminal justice system as well. And there's a lot of things with social media that we're not even discussing here. You've got to consider plays a role in the mental capacity and the process of what a child is thinking as they're developing into adults. Utah's policy history has changed over time. It used to be that Utah did impose JLWOP with a minimum age of 14. Over some adjustments and changes, namely in 2003 and then again in 2008, Utah now has abolished JLWOP, and instead they now have a minimum of 25 years. But any child under the age, or essentially any juvenile, so someone under the age of 18, cannot be convicted of a capital crime without parole. This is important. This is not something that is affected now by the national policies, but the state of Utah has made some changes. So this, I think, with the environment and the fact that Utah State's based out of Utah, and everyone maybe in this group is from Utah, and I understand that, but I would say that's something to consider. If the state that you live in, or many of us do, and the school that we're going to, is leaning in that direction, that may be something to consider for those that are on the fence. So here's some supports for this policy. Now, the opposing side. Many supporters of juvenile life without parole sentences argue that life in prison is not an unusual punishment for serious and violent crimes such as murder. Therefore, a juvenile life sentence without parole is not a violation of the Eighth Amendment in homicide cases. Occasions to punish to the harshest possible penalty are uncommon. Therefore, those juveniles that receive life without parole have committed a crime serious enough to warrant such punishment. And then they say this tagline, adult time for adult crime. Mature society may determine that it is necessary to remove those guilty of the most heinous crimes from the midst for the protection of the members regardless of age. Harsh punishment will deter future crime. A large portion, 52% of juveniles that receive JLWOP sentences are within a year of legal age in most states. So all these points, good, but you also got to consider the fact that we're talking about the entire life. We're not saying that they're not going to be tried and not going to prison for a period of time. But there's just the way that they're doing it, I believe, and our group believes, is inhumane. So we'll continue talking about their side, and then we'll come back around to that later. So, rebuttal for the Supreme Court. When discussing the case of Miller versus Alabama, Supreme Court Justice Scalia, Thomas, Alito, and Roberts all determined that the role of the courts was to apply the law, not answer questions of morality or social policy. They stated, the pertinent law here is the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Today the court invokes that amendment to ban a punishment that the court does not itself characterize as unusual. So this is their reason to say that it's not. Some other statistics. 92% of JLWOP cases are homicides. This statistics play a supporting argument for violent crime because, well, obviously a lot of them are, criminals that are killing people. So that's obviously a significant thing. I think that most of us already probably assume that, but that's what they're saying. Another thing is, in 1982, JLWOP sentences began to increase, peaking in 1996. Supporters of JLWOP would argue that the statistics prove the harsher punishments inflicted on juvenile convicts did deter crime. Here we see the rise and fall of youth offenders serving a sentence of life without parole. There's a lot of factors that go into this, and just consider that statistics like this only lean so much in their direction because what other factors took place, what other things such as the war on drugs that we talked about before may also play a factor in different things. Age. 52% of juveniles with a life sentence are within a year of the majority of states' legal age of 18. This is another statistic they would lean for in their favor. Now we're going to go talk a little bit more about some other factors to take into consideration. One counter-argument is that children lack the maturity and development to be tried as adults. This is based on the Miller versus Alabama 2012 case that mandatory youth life without parole sentences should be abolished, saying children are constitutionally different from adults for sentencing purposes. Their lack of maturity and underdevelopment sense of responsibility lead to recklessness, impulsivity, a heedless risk-taking. They are more vulnerable to negative influences from outside pressures, including that from family and peers. They have limited control over their environment and lack the ability to essentially keep themselves from horrific crime-producing settings. Because of this, the child's character is not as well formed as an adult's. His or her traits, are less fixed, and his actions are less likely to be evidence of irretrievable depravity. Essentially, a child doesn't understand and comprehend the magnitude of their choices. There's so many examples of this, and I think this is a statistic that needs to be emphasized a lot. The fact that this is a biological difference between adults and children. We're seeing, why can't children drink and do tobacco and even renting a car a lot of times until 25 without it costing more or being able to do that. There's so many things. Why is driving more expensive? All these things, all these factors will just completely play into these facts. So it's something very important to consider. Another part of the counter-argument is our brain. Like I said before, it doesn't even tend to mature until 25. And the frontal lobe is growing. Maturity starts plateauing around 18, which is why all of the legal age of adulthood in most countries, not all, but the United States, which is what we're talking about here, is the age of 18. While if so much is built, our society is built around the age of 18, why would we change it with criminal cases and laws? It just doesn't make sense. Here's some precedent cases to consider. Rupert versus Simmons. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 ruling that the death sentence could not be applied to acts committed by someone under the age of 18. Another one, Graham versus Florida. The Supreme Court expanded its ruling to cover juvenile offenders convicted of non-homicide crimes and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release. The court determined that these sentences were unconstitutional under the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, which, of course, the other argument said that's not the case. However, Supreme Court leaned against that. Miller versus Alabama, which we discussed earlier, the same thing. Teenagers given guilty of murder of life sentence without prospect of parole is a cruel and unusual punishment. Montgomery versus Montgomery versus Louisiana. The court concluded that Miller had created a substantive rule since it forbade the imposition of the life sentence without the possibility of release for juvenile offenders. This rule should be retroactively applied to all juveniles now serving mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole. So over 2,400 children that are now serving, this should break that, because right now they are being sexually exploited. Let's just be honest and frank about this as adults here. That is happening. They are being violently affected. There are adults that are taking advantage of these children. That is unquestionable. Isn't that a more harsh punishment? Because now we're allowing more crime to be taken against children, which are now going to scar them more, and they're going to just be worse even in the criminal justice system, which they may even do more violent crimes as they get older just because of that environment where they could have been good members of society. You don't know in the future. I mean, if they're 15 and they're going to be living to 100, you really think that those 15 first years, where really they probably had about 5 that they could make, even some of these actions that they could physically even do, those 5 years are going to now affect them for their next 85 years. It seems very dramatic, and there are other programs we could use with all the money that we pay the government and taxes. There's got to be some other better way to create an environment to reintegrate these criminals into society again, and do it separately from what we are how we are sentencing adults that are criminals in the same category. So some pros and cons. In evaluating the pros and cons of life without parole, it's important to consider the broader context of the criminal justice system, societal values, and the goals of punishment and rehabilitation, which I just discussed. That's important. We discussed that in multiple presentations over the semester. I think we need to remember that, especially when it's in the context of youth. Different perspectives exist. It's obvious. We're in a divided country. There's 2 main parties, and they go back and forth all the time, and half of it is more focused on money and power, but that's not the point. The point is there's a lot of things here to really unpack and say, well, why are the statistics lean one way or the other? Who's really benefiting? And at the end of the day, if this was your sibling or your child that had this, would you want them to be going to prison for the rest of their lives? You've got to consider that. I think that there is something to be said for second chances. There are certain people that are adults that had a lot of time to think and to grow and develop. That's a different situation. We're talking about children here that have had very little time to make life-altering decisions. In fact, most of them have not made any decisions for themselves. They don't even decide where they go to school. How can they decide things like this and not be given at least a little bit of grace based on that alone and the mental capacity that they have and societal standing that they have? In conclusion, we believe that juvenile life sentences without parole are a cruel and unusual punishment. Statistics and facts-based evidence support our conclusion. It is apparent that all factors need to be evaluated on an individual basis, especially when there is an extreme violence that would be considered horrific enough to justify such a harsh sentence. However, even in these circumstances, we believe that they are likely better punishments out there that would be more fitting for a developing juvenile who may still have potential to one day become a productive member of society. Here are our references for our presentation today. Again, thank you for your time. My name is Chris Jackson. My group members are Victoria Anderson, Reagan Bell, Lily Ann Hall, and Rachel Ball. Thank you for your time, and hopefully this helps you in making a more informative decision on where you stand.